Hey there. Just this morning I received a question from a friend, and I thought that it was a good enough question and one that some of you maybe had thought of and had the question before, or maybe hadn't thought of at all. But I thought it was very relevant and probably useful just to make a quick video about it for those who may find it useful. But the question was regarding worship, and specifically something that this young man had heard worship leaders say. The question was in regards to when the corporate church is gathered together, and some basically some introductory announcements are given, and then we're about to enter into worship. We're about to sing some songs, and the worship leader will say, God is in this place, so press into His presence, or draw close to Him, or something like that. But essentially it was that phrase, God is in this place, that he had a question about. Is that an appropriate thing to say? And my answer was both yes and no. When we talk about God is in this place, we're talking about geography, presence, and so basically what I told him is there's three instances in my opinion. Some say only two, but everybody would say at least two, possibly three, and ways in which God is somewhere. And one of those is what historically has been called as omnipresence. And that's the idea that God is everywhere. There's nowhere that God is not. We would get that from things like Psalm 139, where David would say, where can I go from? Where can I flee from your presence? Where can I go where you're not? Everywhere I go, you're there. And so we, all Orthodox Christians, affirm that God is everywhere in some senses. But there's also this second way in which, God seems to have His presence focalized, in some geographic area. We see that in the Old Testament with the temple, and then you had the Holy of Holies, and God's presence was there. Solomon would sometimes, there's occasions where Solomon would say things like, you can't dwell in a house. I've built this temple for you, but God's not contained in temples and houses and all the rest. But so he's kind of making a distinguishment between the omnipresence of God and the focalized presence of God. But there was a very real sense in which God's presence was present in that Holy of Holies in a way that it was not present anywhere else. So we kind of have these degrees of presence, I guess, if you will. And I would make the same application to the church. I would say that God's presence is in the corporate church, the gathered church, in a way that it's not anywhere else. And one passage that sort of alludes to that, and it's often taken out of context, but it's from Matthew 18, where God says, where two or more are gathered in my name, there I am in your midst. And that passage actually has to do with church discipline, but nonetheless, it is saying that God is there in a special sense in which, He's not other places. So I would say that's true. But really, I think when a worship leader says God's presence is in this place, press into Him, he may be meaning that sort of that second way. But I think more often than not, what he's really saying is that third way, and it's the third way is often associated with the thought of revival, and I guess some biblical phrases would be, God pouring out His Spirit. Now, even that's ambiguous because that's used in different ways too. But this way in which God's presence can sort of overwhelm us and overtake us, and we can kind of be immersed in it and changed. And it's very experiential, which is always hard to pin down and always hard to define, because by definition experience is subjective. But I think that's the way that most worship leaders would use that phrase, God is in this place, let's press into Him. And so the question is that appropriate? And is it appropriate in the sense of His omnipresence? Yes, it always is. Is it appropriate in the sense of the corporate church gathering together? Yes, always. It's always appropriate to say God's presence is there. But is it always appropriate to say it in that third sense? No, I don't think that is, and at least not necessarily. And an example of that would be Revelation chapter 3, this letter that Jesus is writing to the church at Laodicea. This is the lukewarm church, and they had lots of bad things going on. But one of the things that Jesus says to him is, I stand at the door and knock. After he's told them to repent, he's told them the things that they're doing wrong, and asked them to repent and change the direction that they're going. And he says, behold, I stand at the door and knock, and if anybody will come and open the door to me, I will come in and I will eat with him and I will dine with him. But the context there is that of an apostate church that is kind of, they think they're doing things good on their own. I mean, it's the epitome of health and wealth and prosperity, if I can use that common phrase. I mean, they were the rich church. They were known for their health, for some of these medicinal things that the town produced, and their wealth. They were very affluent and wealthy, and yet basically what Jesus is saying is look, you guys here at this church in Laodicea, you can go about having your church services, but I'm just going to wait outside. I mean, that's what we have there. We have a church in which Jesus Christ, the head of the church, is waiting outside, knocking on the door to get back into his church. And so there's a very real sense in which the worship leader in Laodicea would have been being presumptuous and actually completely wrong by saying to the people in Laodicea, okay, God's presence is in this place. Now let's press into him. Because actually his presence wasn't in that place. In an omnipresent sense it was, and probably even in that second sense that I described that it was, but most certainly not in the third sense. Because God in human flesh, Jesus had specifically said that he had withdrawn his presence from that place. So some things to think about when we speak of God being somewhere and the ways in which God is in the church. So I hope that was helpful to somebody.